Hello, and welcome to the New York State Archives webinar on the Minorities and Women in Business Enterprise, or MWBE, program. The focus of this presentation will be on how the MWBE program relates to and impacts applicants for the Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund, or LGRMIF, grant program, which is why we are calling this a light introduction. This is number 6 in a series of webinars on the LGRMIF program. The other webinars are LGRMIF Grants Introduction, number 1, Shared Services, number 2, How to Use eGrants, the application process, number 3, Project Narrative, number 4, and LGRMIF Application Forms and Tips, number 5. Your presenters for this webinar are Mark Monyak, Head of the Archives Grants Administration Unit, and Carrie Lynch, Grants Specialist at the Grants Administration Unit. In this webinar, we will look at the various methods of complying with MWBE requirements and the forms you are required to submit. At the end of this presentation, we will list where you can access more information and submit any questions you may have. Our objectives in this presentation are to give you an overview of the MWBE program, including a little history and background and its overall purpose. We will also discuss the MWBE requirements, which are pursuant to Article 15A of the New York State Executive Law, the legislation that created the program. They apply when you submit an application for grant funding that exceeds $25,000 for the full grant period. The Education Department has its own MWBE unit, which oversees compliance with these requirements. They can also assist in answering any questions you may have. Next, we will explain the various levels of compliance you can apply for, a few of which are particular to the LGRMIF program only. With these different levels of compliance also come different forms that you must submit. Some of these forms have been tailored by the Grants Unit for our program, such as adding a preferred source level of compliance. A handful of the forms must be submitted no matter what level of compliance you are filing for. Others are particular to a specific level. We will review all of these forms later on in this presentation. What is the MWBE program? And well, you might ask. The Minorities and Women in Business Enterprise program was established in the state of New York in order to promote equality in state contracting and is managed by the Empire State Development's Division of Minority and Women's Business Development, which was created in 1988. The participation goal is 30% of your total discretionary non-personal service budget for each year of your grant. Discretionary non-personal service budget is defined as total annual budget, excluding the sum of funds budgeted for professional and staff salaries and fringe benefits. For LGRMIF purposes, project-related expenditures with a preferred source vendor, as defined under Section 162 of the State Finance Law, are also excluded. If you are requesting funding that exceeds $25,000, you are required to comply with MWBE requirements as defined in Article 15A of New York State Executive Law. All state agencies are required to participate in the program, and as noted in the previous slide, the Education Department has set up its own MWBE unit to assure that the department complies with this requirement. This unit will review your paperwork and determine if you have met all of the requirements of your intended level of compliance. Receiving MWBE approval is one of the conditions of having your budget approved should you receive a grant. The Grants Unit cannot forward your FS10 proposed budget to the Department's Grants Finance Unit until we have received approval of your MWBE paperwork from the MWBE unit. For LGRMIF purposes, there are 5 methods of compliance: full participation, partial participation with a partial waiver, no participation with a full waiver, no participation based on your MWBE goal of $0, and using a preferred source. For the LGRMIF program, you also have the option of deferring compliance. All MWBE-related documentation should be submitted with your application. If you cannot provide this documentation at that time, you then have 30 days from the date of your award notification to submit the appropriate paperwork. More on this later. We will discuss each of these methods in detail in subsequent slides. But first, let's take a quick look at the MWBE directory of certified vendors and where on our website you can find more information on the MWBE program. In order to meet the department's MWBE requirements, you must use a certified MWBE vendor. Vendors are certified by the Division of Minority and Women's Business Development, DMWBD, which also maintains the New York State Directory of Certified Vendors. Note that not-for-profit organizations are not eligible for this certification. When looking for a certified MWBE vendor, you should use this directory. You can access this directory from our MWBE compliance webpage. You have a number of search choices, including certification type by name, description of services, commodity code, contact person, location, work districts or regions, and reference. For example, if you use the search term records management in the description of services field, you will come up with a list of records management consultants who are certified. Please note that as of the spring of 2020, the Education Department's MWBE unit will only accept MWBE certification from currently certified New York State firms. They do not accept certification from firms that have applied for and/or are seeking certification. These firms will not count towards your MWBE goal. They also do not accept certification from New York City, New Jersey, the Port Authority, or, quote, any other entity outside New York State, close quote. This means they only accept vendors that have been certified by the DMWBD. They will accept no other certification process. When searching for a DMWBD certified vendor, be sure to check to see they are currently certified. Now let's look at where you can find more information about the MWBE process on our website. For a quick reference on the MWBE process and the LGRMIF program, you can visit our MWBE compliance webpage. This page is but one of several pages that highlight our LGRMIF program on the Archives website. Here you can find information on levels of compliance, reporting, and forms. You will also find links to the directory of MWBE vendors, the home page of the Division of Minority and Women's Business Development, and legislation, including Article 15A of the New York State Executive Law and Section 162 of the State Finance Law. There is also a compliance checklist with links to the various forms you need to complete. We'll post this web address at the end of the presentation. Methods of compliance. Let's next look at the methods of compliance and the forms you need to submit with each level. Full participation is the preferred method of compliance. This level is achieved when you meet or exceed the participation goals for your grant. Remember that the MWBE goal is to have 30% of your total discretionary non-personal services go towards a certified MWBE vendor. Discretionary non-personal service budget is defined as the total amount of your budget, excluding the sum of funds budgeted for 1. Direct personal services, which includes professional and support staff salaries and fringe benefits. 2. Rent, lease, utilities, and indirect costs. which are not eligible expenses in the LGRMIF program. And 3, project-related expenses with a preferred source vendor as defined under Section 162 of the State Finance Law. For LGRMIF purposes, preferred sources are the New York State Industries for the Disabled, NYSID, and New York State Preferred Source Program for New Yorkers who are blind, or NYS PSP, for record storage cartons, imaging, and data destruction only. For the most part, these would be expenses listed in purchase services and supplies and materials. Note that neither NYSID nor NYS PSP are preferred sources for software. Let's say you can meet only part of the 30% MWBE goal, but not all of it. In that case, you would then file for a partial participation, partial request for a waiver. We'll look at that option in the next slide. The partial participation, partial waiver level of compliance comes into play if you can only meet part of your 30% goal. Let's say you are proposing a project in the inactive records category, and you need to hire a consultant to conduct an inventory of your records. You are also planning on purchasing materials to upgrade your inactive records storage area, such as a ladder, shelving, etc. The consultant purchase would be in purchase services, and the materials would be in supplies and materials. Both of these purchases are considered non-personal services. Thus, they are subject to MWBE compliance. You have found an MWBE certified consultant, but the expense to be paid to them does not add up to the 30% goal, and you cannot find any MWBE certified vendors that meet the form, function, and utility of your project to purchase the materials for your record storage area. In this case, you would file for a partial participation, partial waiver request. In the example in the slide, the 30% MWBE goal adds up to $12,000. Remember, that is 30% of your total discretionary budget, excluding personal services and preferred source services. In this example, you can only find certified MWBE vendors to purchase $6,000 worth of goods and/or services, which adds up to only half of your 30% goal. Thus, you file for partial participation, partial waiver. The caveat here is that this is acceptable only if you have made good faith efforts to achieve full participation, but were unsuccessful in your efforts. You also have to provide detailed examples of your good faith efforts. We will discuss that in more detail when we talk about forms. Now let's say you cannot find any MWBE vendors that meet the form, function, and utility of your project. In that case, you would file paperwork for no participation request for waiver. We will discuss that method in the next slide. In the previous slide, we looked at partial participation, where you could only meet part of the 30% goal. If you cannot meet that 30% goal either in full or in part, you must file for no participation request for waiver. An example of this would be if you had all your expenses in supplies and materials, and you cannot find any MWBE vendors that meet the form, function, and utility required of your project. Another example would be if you were applying under the historical records category and were proposing to hire a professional conservator to survey the preservation needs of your historical records. As you search the MWBE directory, you discover there are no professional conservators that are certified MWBE vendors, and thus you need to hire a non-MWBE vendor. In both of these cases, you would file for no participation request for waiver. As in the partial participation, partial waiver request, you have to show proof of good faith efforts to find MWBE vendors in order to meet this level of compliance. Next up, we'll look at preferred sources. This level of compliance comes into play when you are proposing to use preferred sources as defined by Section 162 of the state finance law, and that takes precedence over meeting MWBE requirements. Briefly, Section 162 preferred source is a requirement to purchase certain goods and services from the following facilitating entities: CoreCraft, New York State Industries for the Disabled, or NYSID, and New York State Preferred Source Program for New Yorkers who are blind, or NYS PSP. For LGRMIF purposes, you would be dealing with either NYSID or NYS PSP, since they are both preferred sources for digital imaging and secure document destruction. NYSID is also a preferred source for the purchase of standard record storage boxes. CoreCraft, a program under the auspices of the Department of Corrections, for the most part manufactures office furniture, which is an ineligible expenditure in the LGRMIF program. Keep in mind that both NYSID and NYS PSP are preferred sources only for digital imaging, shredding, and file boxes. When calculating your MWBE goal, you can only exclude those services and goods from your calculation. Any other goods or services you propose to purchase from them, such as software, must be included as part of your goal calculation. New York State requires the use of preferred sources as long as they can meet the form, function, and utility that you require to successfully complete your project. If they cannot, you are not obligated to use them. The same goes for MWBE vendors. If you cannot find one that meets those three elements, you are not obligated to use them. What does form, function, and utility mean? Well, generally speaking, it could be a level of expertise you require. It could also be a matter of cost or some other issue specific to your institution and your proposed project that neither a preferred source nor an MWBE vendor can meet. In both cases, you have to provide documentation as to why either the preferred source or the MWBE vendor or vendors could not meet the form, function, and utility required of your project. It's important to remember that these are for cases where you are utilizing the preferred source for either imaging, shredding, or the purchase of file boxes only. In other words, your MWBE goal should add up to $0 to qualify for this level of compliance. If your goal calculation amount is above $0, meaning you have other goods and or services to purchase that do not fall under the preferred source umbrella, you cannot use the preferred source method of compliance. The next level of compliance we will look at involves all of your expenditures in personal services. This method is pretty straightforward and is acceptable when all of your grant expenditures are in the personal service budget codes only. These include professional and or support staff salaries, budget codes 15 and 16 respectively, and employee benefits, budget code 80. These three budget codes are excluded from any MWBE goal calculation. The last method of compliance we will look at is deferred compliance, which is not really complying with MWBE requirements, but deferring meeting those requirements until you receive notification of an award. This is unique to the LGRMIF program. If you are unable to identify a participating MWBE vendor or vendors at the time of submitting your application, you have the option to defer compliance until you receive an award notification. You will then have 30 days from the date of notice of an award to submit the necessary documents to apply for one of the methods of compliance mentioned in the previous slides. You will also need to respond satisfactorily to any follow-up questions from the State Education Department's MWBE unit. Failure to do so may result in the loss of funding. While we recognize the anxiety and stress of putting together an application, we strongly encourage you to submit the necessary MWBE paperwork with your application if at all possible. On the other hand, if you are feeling pressed for time and are unable to do the necessary work and research to locate any potential MWBE vendor or vendors, we also recommend that you focus on completing the application and deal with the MWBE paperwork once you receive an award notice. Just keep in mind the 30-day window. Before we leave the methods of compliance and go on to forms, we just wanted to point out the compliance checklist, which outlines the forms required for each level of compliance. Use this checklist to determine which forms are required for each level of compliance. Note that the goal calculation worksheet, cover letter, and the EEO 100 staffing plan are required no matter what level of compliance you are requesting. The full checklist, with links to the forms in a fillable PDF format, is available on our website as part of our LGRMIF web pages. Note, the Education Department's MWBE unit requires all MWBE forms be submitted in an electronic format. You can submit them to the Grants Unit via email at archgrants@nysed.gov or upload them directly to your LGRMIF eGrants account. And now, Carrie will guide us through the specifics of MWBE forms.
Thank you, Mark. The MWBE goal calculation worksheet, along with the MWBE cover letter and the EEO staffing plan, are the three forms that are required for all methods of compliance. The goal calculation sheet is the form where you determine what your MWBE goal in terms of expenses will be. Here you enter your various project expenditures. On line 1, you enter your total approved budget. You'll notice that for lines 2 through 6, the form matches budget codes on your FS10 proposed budget. The middle column identifies these expenses as being excluded from your MWBE goal calculation. If you have any expenses in these budget codes, enter the appropriate amounts in the appropriate budget codes. The only budget line on the form that does not pertain to the LGRMIF program is line 6 for rent, leases, and utilities. These are ineligible expenses in the LGRMIF program. Add up the amounts for lines 2 through 5 and enter that amount on line 7. Subtract line 7 from line 1, your total budget, and enter that amount on line 8. Multiply line 8 by 30%, or 0.30 on line 9, to determine the amount of your MWBE goal, and enter that amount on line 10. Remember, if your goal on line 10 is greater than $0 and you are using preferred sources, you must file for a full or a partial waiver. Also note that for LGRMIF purposes, you need to submit the appropriate goal calculation sheet for the particular grant cycle you are submitting an application. This is indicated in the RFP number listed at the top of the form. In the slide example, the form is for the 2020-2021 grant cycle. The year is indicated by the first 2 digits after the letters GC. The archives will provide the appropriate form for each grant cycle. The form is available along with all other forms we'll be discussing on our MWBE compliance webpage. The second always required form is the MWBE cover letter. On this form, you indicate what method of compliance you are filing for. You are also certifying that your institution is adhering to the requirements for your chosen method of compliance. The form requires the signature of an authorized representative of your institution. You need to have this person sign and date the form before submitting it. You'll notice that there is no deferred compliance choice on the form. This is because there's no need for this form if you are deferring compliance. Only when you have determined your method of compliance do you need to submit the cover letter, along with the appropriate supporting forms and documentation. Note that in the eGrant system, where you create and submit your LGRMIF grant application, you can also indicate your MWBE compliance level, including the deferred compliance method. Our third and last always required form is a federal form, the Equal Employment Opportunity Form 100 Staffing Plan. This is required by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. This form can be a little confusing and seems to be the one that people have the most difficulty completing. As a result, we'll be breaking it down over the next few slides. The purpose of this form is to compile data on either your total workforce or the staff, if any, that will be working just on your proposed project. So let's look at the EEO 100 in more detail. Let's start at the top, usually a good place to begin. The top lines are for information about your institution, such as the name of your institution on the applicant line, address, telephone number, Federal Employee Identification Number, or FEIN, and project number, which is generated by the eGrant system when you create an application. Below this information are two boxes where you need to indicate which workforce you are supplying data for in the EEO job categories table below. You need to check one of these boxes. The first box is for the workforce that will be utilized only for the proposed project or contract, which is the term the form uses. Check the second box only if you are including data on your total workforce. That would be your everyday staff at your institution. Why would you check one and not the other? Let's say you have a project on which you will be hiring temporary staff, such as temporary inventory clerks or a consultant. In this case, you would check the first box. However, if you are reporting on all of your staff, whether they're working on your grant project or not, you would check the second box. Generally speaking, if you are hiring staff to work on your project, including staff from your own institution, you would check the first box and include statistics only on them in the chart. Otherwise, you would check the second box and include statistics on your total regular staff. Now let's look at the bottom half of the form, the chart. The left column of the chart has a list of EEO job categories. Find each category that is appropriate to either your project workforce or your total workforce. Then fill in figures for each of the appropriate columns to the right, including the total workforce for each job category. The columns to the right take into account race and ethnicity. Note that there are separate segments for male and female under the non-Hispanic or Latino headings. Be sure to include totals at the bottom of each of the appropriate columns. When done, be sure to complete the very bottom lines of the form for the signature or name of preparer, date, and telephone or email contact information. Next, we'll look at forms that are specific to the method of compliance you are filing for. The MWBE Form 102, Notice of Intent to Participate, is required when filing for full participation and partial participation. These methods of compliance mean you can either fully or partially meet your MWBE goal by using goods or services from MWBE certified vendors. The form requires that both you and the vendors complete different parts of the form. You, the applicant, also known as the bidder on the form, complete Part A. Part A asks for your institution's name, address, FEIN, and phone or email contact information. Be sure to also have the form signed by an authorized representative and date it. Once you have completed Part A, forward the form to your MWBE vendor. The vendor must complete Parts B and C, including certification status. They must also sign and date the form. You must complete and submit a separate Form 102 for each MWBE vendor you intend to contract with. Once the vendor has completed Parts B and C, they return the completed form to you. It is your responsibility to ensure they have completed the form properly and that you have received forms from all of your MWBE vendors. Since the Education Department's MWBE unit requires that all MWBE forms be submitted electronically, you can exchange electronic versions with your vendors. In addition to the MWBE Form 102, for full and partial participation, you also need to submit Form 100, the utilization plan, which we'll look at in the next slide. The purpose of the utilization plan is to provide details on how you plan to utilize each MWBE certified vendor you plan on contracting with. Once again, you are the bidder or applicant, so be sure to complete any section that calls for information under those terms. As the applicant, it is your responsibility to complete the whole form. The top part of the form has fields for information on your institution, such as contact information and your Federal Employee Identification Number, FEIN, as well as your project number. The middle part of the form has fields where you enter information on any certified MWBE vendors that you have contracted with. Enter the name, contact information, and federal ID number for each vendor. Check whether they are an MBE or a WBE. Include a description of the goods and/or services to be obtained from the vendor. In the far right field, indicate the value of the goods and/or services. Be sure to have the form signed by the preparer and complete the fields in the lower left, including the name of the preparer and their contact information. Next, we'll examine the forms required for filing for any kind of waiver. If you are requesting either a partial or a full waiver of your MWBE goal, you will need to complete Form 101, Request for Waiver. This form is completed entirely by you, the applicant. Once again, you are the bidder or applicant, so complete the top part of the form with your institution's name, address, telephone or email contact information, FEIN, and project number. In the table in the middle, you indicate whether you are claiming a full or a partial waiver, either for an MBE, a WBE, or both. Check the total box for a total waiver and the partial box for a partial waiver. For the partial waiver, indicate what percentage of the MWBE goal you are claiming a waiver for. Be sure to sign and date the form and include the name and title of the preparer and contact information. As noted earlier, in order to claim a waiver, you need to demonstrate and document good faith efforts to obtain MWBE vendors. In the next couple of slides, we'll look at the forms and documentation required for demonstrating good faith efforts. Throughout this presentation, we have mentioned good faith efforts on a number of occasions. Employing good faith efforts is key to obtaining any kind of waiver. Form 105, Contractor's Good Faith Efforts, is where you certify that you have made those efforts. The term contractor refers to your institution, the applicant. Along with this form, you must also submit evidence of good faith efforts. If you submit only the signed form, the MWBE unit will not approve your waiver request. The form contains a list of documentation that can be used as evidence. You do not necessarily need to submit everything on that list. Some may not apply to your situation. You do, however, need to provide substantial, detailed documentation of your efforts. For example, do not just provide a copy of an initial email solicitation to an MWBE vendor, but rather include a full email exchange with them. Provide specific reasons on why an MWBE vendor was not chosen by providing details on how they were unable to meet the form, function, and utility required of your project. As part of this evidence, you could include a copy of your RFP with a memo on official letterhead explaining the lack of MWBE applicants. Besides the Form 105, you must also submit the Form 105A, Contractor Unavailable, when submitting evidence of good faith efforts. We'll talk about that form in the next slide. Form 105 certifies that you made good faith efforts to obtain MWBE vendors. Form 105A documents who those vendors were and summarizes the reason for not choosing them. On this form, the term contractor refers to the MWBE vendors you sought to hire but were unable to. Your institution is the bidder or applicant. This form certifies that you contacted the vendors, so it requires a signature from your authorized representative. The middle part of the form has you list the vendors, along with contact information, estimated budget to go to them, type of work they do, and the reason for contacting them. That is, what part of your project they would be taking on. Below this section are a number of checkboxes indicating the reasons the listed vendors were not selected, unavailable for work on the project, or unable to provide a quote. Check appropriate reasons given by each vendor contacted, meaning you could have more than one reason checked off. Remember, this form must be submitted with Form 105 and evidence of good faith efforts. One last note on the forms. They are all available as fillable PDFs on our website on the MWBE compliance page. We'll provide the address for that page in the last slide. We've covered a lot of information, so let's summarize the things we've talked about. A quick review of what we've covered. Try to meet your MWBE goal of 30% in whole or in part. If you need to request a waiver, be sure to submit the appropriate forms and provide specific, detailed evidence of your good faith efforts. If you cannot locate an MWBE vendor while writing your application, you can claim deferred compliance at the time of submitting your application. Keep in mind that your first 50% payment is contingent upon receipt and approval of your MWBE paperwork by the MWBE unit. Try to factor this in when developing a timeline for your project. If at all possible, try to submit your MWBE paperwork at the time of your application. It will save some time in terms of receiving your first payment. Remember that a preferred source is one that is defined by Section 162 of the State Finance Law. This is the only definition of a preferred source that takes precedence over MWBE requirements. BOCES do not constitute a preferred source under this definition. Bear in mind also that for LGRMIF purposes, imaging, secure document destruction, and standard record storage boxes are the only services and goods that fall under a preferred source vendor. You can find forms and other MWBE-related information on our website. Use the address in the slide and click on the MWBE compliance link on the left-hand side of the home screen. Remember, all forms must be submitted electronically in PDF format to archgrants@nysed.gov or uploaded to your eGrants account. If you are awarded an LGRMIF grant, you might find partway through your project that you need to amend your budget. If changes to your budget result in a change to your MWBE participation status, you must file new paperwork to reflect that change. Grantees are required to report to the MWBE unit at the end of their projects regarding total funds paid out to MWBE vendors. So if that is changing from the original project proposal, it must be reviewed and approved by SED's MWBE unit. Grantees should be aware of the impact of budget amendments on their project's MWBE status and refile paperwork if needed. This is the last of 6 modules in our LGRMIF grant application training series. You are encouraged to view all of them and view them in order. You certainly do not have to, but doing so will give you a more complete and better understanding of the LGRMIF application process and will assist you in creating a stronger application. We've come to the end of our MWBE presentation, and we want to thank you for joining us. We hope we have provided you with some useful information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact the Grants Unit at the email address in the slide, archgrants@nysed.gov. You can also contact the MWBE unit directly at their email address, which is mwbegrants@nysed.gov. We also encourage you to look at our MWBE compliance page on our website for more detailed information on MWBE compliance and the LGRMIF program. Good luck with your project and with your efforts to comply with MWBE requirements. Thanks for joining us.